Does your secondary character suck? That's what we're covering today, so if you are writing a novel and want to learn how to captivate your audience, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. I post writing-related videos twice a week. But without further ado, welcome to Bound by Words. My name is Madie, if we haven't met yet. I am a full-time editor and a fantasy writer, and I think, like many things in a novel, a secondary character can make or break a story. I feel like there is a lot that can be done really well or can be done really poorly with that dynamic. Not every book has like a main and a secondary character. Some books have two main characters and no one else matters. Some books have group casts. But if you have two characters or even one main character and a group of secondary characters, it's important that you get the secondary characters, their individual personalities and quality in the story right, or you risk having your story feel very underdeveloped. I think there are really three main types of secondary characters, three ways that I classify them in my brain at least. The first is having like a dual point of view book or a romance character. So sometimes in dual point of view you have like one main point of view and then a secondary point of view, which may or may not be just as important but shows up less. Sometimes when you do dual point of view, you have two characters of like equal weight here, and we're not really talking about that today, but there might be some helpful tips when it comes to distinguishing how both of them are important in this video. But there are many situations where one is more important than another one. Not just dual point of view, but also in like romance tropes. A lot of the times romance can be a subplot into like another genre or another type of story. So because it's a subplot, usually one of the characters is less important, but also in a lot of just general romance books, you have a main character that you're following and their love interest isn't as important unless it's like, as we said, that equal weighted dual point of view. Other than that, in a lot of romances, one of them is more important. So that's the first sort of type of secondary character I think you can have. The second type is to have like a best friend or a partner in crime. I think a lot of stories really utilize this well. I don't want to mention any specific stories because I don't want to create spoilers for anybody, but you'll have this pairing where you have your main protagonist or even a side character and they have like a little mini sidekick where they're either following them around all the time or they click really well, or maybe as their environment shifts they have one person that they really gravitate towards who sort of helps them feel at home. I call it best friend in my head because I feel like in a lot of stories you have like the A world and the B world, and you have that element definitely in the first world. I think that's something that's done the most is you have a main character throughout the whole story, and in their A world, which is their ordinary everyday, they have somebody they're close to, and in their B world they have somebody separate they're close to, and we're going to talk more about that later. But I think of it definitely as a just friendship pairing. And then the third type of secondary characters that's really important is a mentor-like character. And you know, everyone references like the world of storytelling's best mentor-like character when we talk about stuff like this, Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Don't at me in the comments, I will never change my mind on that. There are a lot of really great mentor-like characters that can be used as examples, but they are also considered a secondary character. But if this trope is written well, a lot of the times people's mentor characters become a lot of the reader's favorite. So that's why it's so important to absolutely nail your secondary character, because it really can make or break the dynamic in some stories. If you have a best friend or partner in crime secondary character, then your protagonist should be ready to like go to war for them, and you can play around with the tension of suspense where when one thing happens to one of them, something's going to happen to the other one. I do think mentor characters are a little bit less common because they're super specific, but when it comes to like dual point of view romance or the best friend sort of setup, I think those are incredibly common in every genre. With that being said, the first thing you need to establish to make sure that your secondary character doesn't suck is to make sure that they complement your main character. They have to honestly complement your main character's personality and way of life in a way that makes sense. If they don't contribute anything to that partnership or to the story, then they might not be necessary, and you don't ever want to keep any characters or scenes in your story that aren't necessary. If you can remove a character, any character from your story, then they probably shouldn't be there in the first place, but a secondary character is such an important role that if you can remove your secondary character, then there's a serious issue. If your protagonist is first priority and your secondary character or group of secondary characters is second priority, then those like groups of people need to be vital to what is going on. And one of the ways to make sure that they are is by making sure whenever they interact with your main character that it makes sense. Readers definitely devour dynamics that are a little bit unorthodox, having somebody who's really cold and rigid and really bubbly, or having somebody who's extroverted and introverted. Those things make sense because they have complementary elements within their like personalities and the way that they address things. If they were total opposites in everything, it really wouldn't make sense for them to hang out or even be working together. I think that's one of the reasons why like enemies to lovers is really, I think, common, because it's two characters who it wouldn't make sense at all for them to get together, and as they spend more time with each other, they either change a little bit or they become more like each other. And I think just watching that growth is really like interesting for a lot of people, but you don't really have the option to do that a lot with secondary characters. It's not something that can't be done, it's just something that's a lot less common than some of the other secondary character setups, and that's just because we want to keep our stories unique. So make sure your secondary character truly complements your main character, and this can be in a variety of ways. It's not that they have to get along, it's not that they have to like morally agree on everything, they just have to have one or two things in common for it to make sense for them to be spending whatever time they're spending together in the book. The second thing I want to talk about, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that some stories have two secondary characters. They'll have a World A character and a World B character, and not all novel planning methods use this or storytelling methods use this, but usually there is an ordinary world at the beginning in almost every story, if not every story, and then there is a shift or change. Whatever your inciting incident changes to, it opens your main character up to an adventure or, you know, meeting new people or trying something new. That's usually the B world, and a lot of storytelling tactics and planning methods really encourage you to have that ordinary world and then that change, and then have them intersect or meet at some point. And I think with secondary characters that this is a big time when those two worlds intersect, because it's very likely in a lot of stories your main character will have a secondary character in their first world, and then they'll switch, and then they'll have a secondary character in their B world, and then at some point those are going to clash back together, and then you're not going to know who's more important to the main character. It's common with love triangles. I think the biggest story that I know is like the Hunger Games. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but that is a pretty well-known story. We know she has a secondary character before she gets called in the games, and then during the game she gets really close to somebody, and then afterwards it's like, who's more important in your life? So don't think that this only applies to one character in your story. Even if you only have like a main and secondary character setup, you might have two across your story, you might have more than two. In a lot of like fiction and fantasy, there are people who can die and move away and anything could happen to them, so your secondary character can shift. And it also doesn't have to be one character at a time. There are a lot of books that have group casts. I'm thinking of Throne of Glass is probably like the best example, where we're getting one person's main point of view to sort of start the story off, and then we have a bunch of different point of views throughout the story. And I feel like in the back of all of our minds, we know that there's like one or two characters that are the most important because they're more established in the first few books, and then other people are incorporated and they're almost just as important. They almost get as much screen time, but almost is the key word. They're definitely secondary entities that were created around the journey of these, you know, two or three like main people. So you can have a group of as many secondary characters as you want, as long as they are all important and affecting the story appropriately. Like we said, if it doesn't need to be in your story, if it can be removed without affecting your story, then it's probably either needs removed or is not done well. And I definitely say that with love because I want to see some amazing well-written stories on my bookshelf in the future. The next thing is that they should be a unique identity within your story, and they should be a unique identity compared to your main character. You don't want to write a yes man. There's nothing worse than that, having a secondary character who is either always there or always agrees with or is always amiable to somebody's like suggestion. There's no realistic close friendship, I feel like, in the world where someone's like, I'm gonna do this thing that's terrible for me, and the other person's like, yes, you should definitely do this thing that's terrible for you 100% of the time. I'm sure that probably happens sometimes. I'm sure on smaller scales. I'm sure maybe with people who aren't that close. I feel like that's a common thing that happens whenever you're stuck trying to interact with somebody you don't want to interact with. Like if I'm in a room with somebody who I'm just being friendly and cordial and I'm not really close to them and they say something, I'm like, yeah, whatever, cool. Doesn't affect me at all. But if you're close and it's the secondary character to your protagonist, whether they're friends, whether they're mentors, whether it's love interest, enemies to lovers, whatever it is, they're gonna have some times where they like butt heads. There's never gonna be a situation where your secondary character should just agree to everything that goes on. And doing that really strips some of their identity away. It makes them feel like not a real person, and it'll also make them feel really two-dimensional. So writing a good secondary character is like almost as difficult as writing a good main character. You have to have somebody who is realistic and believable, who acts in a way that's natural, who interacts, reacts, you know, like they're gonna make decisions of their own. They're gonna have their own hobbies, they're gonna have their own takes on things. I think it's more reasonable to have more headbutting or more conversation or banter between characters than it is to have somebody there that is just always up for whatever. Even if two people are like on the same path and the same mindset, get along great, have, you know, similar goals, they're not going to have the same personality traits or the same ways to approach things. For example, two people might want to purchase something. One person might put it on a credit card, somebody else might save up. Two people might want to travel to the same city. One person might book a flight and one person might drive. And they might have very specific reasons they want to do that. Maybe driving makes them carsick. Maybe the other person's driving just because planes are expensive. Every character is going to have a different way to mentally dissect and approach a problem, even if they are 100% like on the same path. So make sure your secondary character is in a unique element in your story, not just from the main character, but from other elements in the story. That way they are realistic, natural, and also memorable. The last thing that I want to say on this, and this is a little bit of a bonus tidbit, less about creating your secondary character and more about writing them and incorporating them into your story. Don't ruin it with the dialogue. You can have an amazing secondary character who is memorable and fresh and original, and you can absolutely butcher it with the dialogue. If you have a main character and a secondary character, no matter how close their importance is, no matter how much screen time they get, if the dialogue between them is unrealistic, rigid, or repetitive, it could ruin the dynamic, but it can also ruin the quality of your secondary character like that. And I really do want to emphasize this because I see it a lot in editing where there's a lot of unnecessary repetition in dialogue, where like we just read 2 or 3 pages of something happening, and then your character meets up with their secondary character, their best friend, their mentor, whoever it is, and then they repeat that back to their secondary character in the dialogue, and it can be boring and it can be dry. You have to say that that recap happened, but you have to be able to skim past it in a way that is understandable without it being, you know, super daunting or boring. Like, we already experienced that. We don't want to experience it again. Even something as little as saying, oh, I just talked to so-and-so and they said, that can even be repetitive and can turn your readers off to either a secondary character or a relationship. And it's not to say that that repetition should never happen in dialogue. There are times where it might be appropriate, especially on smaller scales, but it shouldn't happen often, and it definitely shouldn't happen in larger scales. If you have large amounts of repetition anywhere in your book, it's going to turn your reader off a little bit because it's going to feel like you're either over repeating or talking down to them. We always want to make sure that we write to an intelligent audience because it's the best way to capture your audience, make sure they continue to turn pages, and get them excited for the next read in the next world. We don't want to over-explain or dumb things down for them. And writing a bad secondary character, whether they're a yes man, whether they're not relevant to the story, whether they just have a personality that clashes with the main character, or if they're being repetitive in dialogue, any of those things will really make your book feel just like it's lacking a little bit of development. So with that, if you've learned anything from this video or you just enjoyed listening, make sure you give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing while you're down there. I post writing related videos twice a week.